And so we are privileged as we go through each and every Starrcade here at the Lapsed Fan to once again be welcomed by the Dean of Pro Wrestling Journalism, Dave Meltzer, who guided us so expertly with context through our 30-week WrestleMania series. Now, upon Thanksgiving 2015, we turn our attention to Starrcade. And Dave, why of all the territories in the country at that point in 1983 was Mid-Atlantic, Jim Crockett Promotions, the most well-positioned to do something on this grand of a scale?
They were the most ambitious, and Jim Crockett had, the family had the most money, and I think that was, they had the hottest territory as well. I mean, what happened in March, they had a really big show in Greensboro with Ricky Steamboat and Jay Youngblood against Sergeant Slaughter and Don Kernodle, with the stipulations that Steamboat and Youngblood would have to split up if they lost, which was gigantic there. They sold out, and they turned, they turned 6,000 people away. And what was unique is in that era, generally speaking, when they ran a show or they had a main event, let's just say it was Ric Flair against Greg Valentine, they would do the same match in Greensboro, Charlotte, Richmond, whatever, throughout in Norfolk. All the major cities would get the same match off the localized television. Well, for whatever reason, they decided instead of doing that stipulation in all the cities, they advertised it for the Greensboro Coliseum. It was I don't know if it was the first time they ever did that, but they did it. So the TV that aired everywhere said, in the Greensboro, aside from Toronto, where Toronto, they did the same match in Toronto. So what they did was in that TV, when they announced it for that city, they were stunned. I mean, they were expecting a good crowd, but they were, the things that they didn't expect was, they didn't expect that kind of a crowd because they'd never drawn anything like that before. And the other thing they didn't expect was people coming from all over the Carolinas for that match, because usually if you were in Greensboro, the Greensboro matches would probably draw from a radius of, 75 miles in every direction from Greensboro. I mean, people from Charlotte didn't go to Greensboro because it's just how it was. You went to your local wrestling. You didn't drive far away to see wrestling. That's just what it was in those days. So, they had the big traffic jam of all these people into town. So all of a sudden it was just like, all these people wanted to come. A lot of them got turned away. They had the attraction in Ric Flair going back for the championship. There was a political reason that they took the title away from Ric Flair, and then they wanted to bring it back. So it all kind of added up that we can do this big closed circuit show. We've got the attraction. We've got and we've proven that we can get the audience for it. So the Steamboat and Youngblood match in March of '83 was really the catalyst for the idea. When that was so successful, that's when they started formulating a plan. And Thanksgiving night in Greensboro was traditionally the biggest attended Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling show of the year, every year. So that was the obvious night to do it.
Going back to the 60s, right?
61 or so, yeah.
Wow. So, of course, Jim Crockett Promotions was an affiliate of the National Wrestling Alliance. Of course, you see the NWA letters on the ring and the mat for, the duration of the 80s, pretty much, until the purchase by Turner in '88. Can you explain to us quickly, as we look at the NWA Championship on the line in the main event of the first Starrcade, how the process went in selecting an NWA champion, what the ins and outs were of the final decision being made that Ric Flair would win on this evening?
Yeah, in those days they had a board of governors. It was 7 promoters, and I'm not sure who the 7 were at that time because it changed. And actually a vote that they would do once a year or so, and usually the champion got to keep it for a long time. And when it was, and then there would be agreements made and things like that. And Rick was voted in '81. And this thing happened in '83, and I'm not exactly sure why they went back to Harley Race, because Rick was younger and better at the time as champion than Harley, and it wasn't to set up Starrcade, believe it or not. There was a reason they wanted to go back, but very quickly after that, the question was who was going to get it from Harley, and the answer was Rick. So that's when they started, okay, when are we going to do it? And that's when Thanksgiving, Greensboro, and all this kind of like blended, it all made sense.
Right place, right time. So how about the political reason that they took it off Flair in the first place? Anything you can tell us about that?
Yeah, I don't really know what the situation was, other than I think Harley wanted it, and Harley had strong allies at the time for the championship. So for whatever reason that they, the key people were willing to put it back on Harley at the time. And Rick was Rick was doing real well in a lot of places, but Harley was kind of a bigger name in some places. So it was just a couple of month thing. I mean, and I think that there was not really a lot of question on whether it was going to go back to Rick or not, because there was really nobody else. I mean, there was talk David Von Erich, but that was probably going to be down the line. I know they did an angle in Texas where David had done an interview where he said that if the next time you come to town, I want the title, and if I don't win, I'm going to retire. And so a lot of us thought that on Thanksgiving, and I was living in Dallas or in Wichita Falls at the time, and a lot of us thought, oh my God, they're going to come in on Thanksgiving night, because Fritz also did a big Thanksgiving show with Harley and David. I mean, that's the only thing that made sense out of that. And I don't know what happened, because he said it once in an interview, and then he never said it again, which tells me that they had a change of mind. Mm-hmm. So I think that David David was definitely being groomed for the title. I just, that from that interview, it made me think, and I still do, that there was talk that David was going to get it, and then it was kind of like, I mean, Rick would have been better than David at that time as champion anyway. So, but I'm thinking, with the power that Fritz had, because his TV was so strong, and they were a real hot promotion too, that may have entered into some debate. But Flair was a more complete package at the time.
Sure. Take a look at this 1983 Ric Flair, Dave, and try to recall him versus the Ric Flair that went on to sort of be cemented, the legacy Ric Flair. He's sort of more understated, though certainly the promo and the comeback on Slater and Orton was incredibly fiery. Even the woo sounded different at the time. Do you see any difference in 1983 Ric Flair winning the title here at Starrcade and the one that everyone will remember forever?
Just a younger version.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't see, he evolved into a more patterned wrestler in time, without a doubt, although he already was kind of a patterned wrestler. I think he developed into a better promo, but he was already an excellent promo. He already had the charisma. So it's I don't think it's a major difference. It's just a question of, 30, he would have been 34, 34-year-old Ric Flair versus 37, 38-year-old Ric Flair. I mean, one of the things about Flair that people don't realize is that, again, he could have been, it was so hard to get that championship. And there's an argument that he should have been the champion a couple of years earlier. I thought so, that he should have been. But, Harley was entrenched, and it really took time to convince people, especially because Rick was such a Carolinas guy and Georgia, and that's where he was really big. And he didn't really go to St. Louis he went to, but he didn't go to a lot of the other places. Whereas Harley had a name everywhere. So, it was an older group of promoters, and they were slow to make changes.
Now, relative to Harley, it kind of strikes me that this would be the end of the NWA World Championship, Starrcade 83, being an NWA belt more than a Jim Crockett Promotions belt. After Flair wins it here, it stays within Jim Crockett Promotions until that's sold to WCW, and then for some years after that. What point do we see marked here in this belt going to Greensboro? And that was played up at the time big, that for the first time fans in this part of the country are going to see a world title change. And not only did they see it, Dave, but it would never really leave the territory, so to speak.
Yeah, except for the couple of weeks with Kerry, which was a favor. But what happened, again, Jim Crockett had the most powerful promotion, and especially not quite at this point, but very shortly after, when Dusty came in as booker, because Dusty, a lot of people think Dusty booked this show, and he did not. This was Dory Funk Jr.'s show. Mm-hmm. But Dusty came in as booker early the next year. And at that point, Florida went down. Georgia had the situation where they went down, and then they were sold. And then, when they came back, it was Crockett that was in charge and things like that. So, or when it was bought back. So the Crockett Promotions was really the strong, they were by far the strongest promotion. And as time went on, Crockett got stronger and had better talent, and everybody else got weaker. So, when you get to that point, they probably should have had everything, although there was a lot of bitterness because a lot of the smaller places that were dying off were also having less access to the champion.
Did Harley Race show up that night, unsure if he wanted to do business? I've heard that he wasn't quite sold on Flair being the guy he would truly pass the torch to.
No, I never heard that. What happened was that that was never an issue. The issue was if he was going to show up at all. Because Vince McMahon was trying to, Vince McMahon's idea was to sign Harley and have him no-show Crockett's biggest show and bring Harley into WWF to lose to Hulk Hogan, so he would have that thing where, it's the real world champion, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, and then go. I mean, he was incubating his own national expansion at that point, so that was a ripe time. I mean, I noticed that Flair in his book says that Crockett offered Race an extra 25 grand to show up and do the honors. And then I've heard other interviews where Race has sort of intimated that he wasn't sure it was the right time for Flair, but it doesn't sound like that's something that's endured as part of the narrative.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. I mean, I just remember at that time. I mean, there was no doubt what was going to happen because Rick said he was going to retire if he lost, also, same as David. So you were kind of backed into a corner at that point. The issue was that Vince wanted Harley to no show, and he offered Harley a lot of money to no show, and for whatever reason, Harley said no. I think the reason was because Harley owned a portion of St. Louis and a portion of the Kansas City promotion. So he felt that he'd be, double-crossing not only his business partners, but himself by screwing with the NWA, since it was an NWA member. So he didn't do it. And Vince was, there's a lot. Vince was very unhappy about it. Vince didn't like not getting his way.
He may have well shot a takedown in the bathroom, as I understand it. May or may not have.
Yeah, there was certainly a version of the story that he shot a takedown. Harley ended up on top, and that was that. I think that as Vince got more and more powerful, that story went more and more away.
Sure.
When Vince didn't win, when Vince wasn't necessarily winning, that story was very prevalent. When Vince won and nobody wanted to say anything bad about Vince for fear of their future,
Yeah.
It became a no comment instead of yes, that's what happened.
Well, Harley eventually, of course, would go to the WWF, and he would go in with the idea that Hogan was, somewhat afraid or paranoid about him. He showed up with a gun or something like that when he eventually made the jump.
That would have actually been earlier. The story was that he showed up when he was owning he still owned the Kansas City promotion, and they ran Kansas City, and then Harley went to the show, and everybody's freaked out. By the time when he came in, Hogan wouldn't work for him. If you look at the thing, normally a guy would come in the territory in those days, and he would immediately, if you were a big star, you would get your shot at Hogan first, and then you'd work your way down. That was how New York. That's how they ran their territory. And what happened was with Harley, they made him wait because Hogan was leery and he wanted to make sure that he would do business and everything like that. And once they had the trust of Harley, then they went and did it. And, the thing with Harley and Hogan was it was a very disappointing program. Not so much the matches. The matches were fine. But as far as drawing goes, even like in St. Louis and Kansas City, where you would think that Harley and Hogan, Harley, the longtime world champion going against Hulk Hogan, would draw huge. And it really didn't draw as huge as you would think. Harley was older, and I think that may have been part of the deal. And Harley was from a different fan base and a different era. I think that the fans of Harley Race kind of maybe knew what was up and weren't really that apt to go to see Harley Race lose to Hulk Hogan.
Now, since we're at that point in time, and we're talking a bit about Vince, late 83, the fall of 83, when Starrcade takes place, such a time of shifting sands in the wrestling industry. Vince, his father, Vince Sr., and Jim Barnett, who was director of operations for WWF at the time, all resigned from the NWA in 1983, and that must have sent shockwaves, right, Dave, through the industry, that they were about to make the move, acquire Hogan from the AWA at the time of Starrcade?
No, everyone was asleep at the wheel. They did resign, but nobody saw, and I don't know why, because it was so obvious. I knew it, but I think that what happened was because a lot of these promoters were friends with Vince Sr. or thought they were friends with Vince Sr. and just believed that this is how it was. And they resigned from the alliance, but, Vern had too, you know what I mean? And there were many years where they weren't part of the alliance.
Yep.
So it was just the idea that, okay, they're going to call Bob Backlund world champion, not WWF champion. So they're resigning. It wasn't that they're coming after us. I think most of the promoters had no idea still they were coming after him until December, whatever it was, I think the 27th, whatever the day was when they had the St. Louis tapings, where they were in St. Louis, and Hogan and Schultz and Gene Okerlund and Roddy Piper all show up. At that point, I think most of them should have seen the writing on the wall. But literally, they didn't know. Until that day, most of the wrestling business did not know what was going to happen, even though the resignation was several months earlier.
That the raids would be on. I mentioned Jim Barnett quickly, if you could, and I know he's such a grand presence in the history of this industry, one of a kind. He'll be a key player as we go through the history of Starrcade, Jim Crockett Promotions, WCW. Quickly, a sketch for our listeners, Jim Barnett, and why he was so significant and how influential he was in the industry.
Jim Barnett, yeah, he was quite the character. He started in as the assistant for Fred Kohler coming out of college, early 50s, I believe, maybe around 1950, 51, when Fred Kohler was actually the leading promoter in the country because he had national television. And he was like his assistant, kind of the position that Larry Matysik had with Sam Mushnick, actually, for many years. And then him and Fred Kohler had a falling out, and then he went on his own. He had backers that he knew from college, and he started a big territory, Indianapolis, Louisville, Denver. I mean, it was actually the biggest territory in the country for a couple of years. And around 64, through some connections in Australia, he went to Australia, and then he had national television in Australia, and he would run with this weekly territory that would run, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, the top cities in that country. And that became the biggest territory in the world in the 60s through, and then some laws changed and things happened. And Jim, he felt his time was up. It was starting to go down. So he came in, and at the same time, there was a big wrestling war in Atlanta going on. And since he was going to come back, the NWA wanted a ruthless guy. I mean, Jim would come off as the least ruthless guy in the world, the least confrontational and everything. But behind the scenes, he was the most ruthless guy, and everybody knew it. So they wanted a ruthless guy to kill off Ann Gunkel, who was running an opposition promotion to them at the time. So they brought Jim in and gave him a percentage of the company. There were some sales made with some of the other promoters, and they got Australia. Jim got Atlanta. So Jim was the guy in charge in Atlanta from 74-ish, I think 73, 74, until the early 80s when Ole Anderson got the evidence kind of on him that he was fueling this lavish lifestyle through the money that Georgia Championship Wrestling made. Mm-hmm. And he was always doing that, but nobody really complained because Georgia Championship Wrestling was such a profitable company that Jim, having his private chef and private driver and $1,000 a month of phone bills and things like that, that was fine when they were making tons of money. All the shareholders were fine with it. Well, when the company started losing money, mm-hmm. because certain things happened, and the key one being that the Atlanta City Auditorium got torn down, so they had to run the Omni every week, or thought they had to. They did run the Omni every week. When they ran the Omni once every, the City Auditorium held about 5,000. And so they would run that every Friday night generally, or Sunday, whatever the day was. And then they would run maybe, once every 6 weeks, they'd have this big blowout show at the Omni. And the thing was people knew that the Omni show, that's when you brought in your Ric Flairs and Dusty was usually on the Fridays, but always on the Omni show. Tony Atlas might be brought in, but the Funks might be brought in, Jack Briscoe, those type of guys. So the feeling was like for the casual fan, they knew that show at the Omni was the one you go to, and it was only every 6 weeks or 2 months, and they always did big business there. Well, when they started running the Omni every week, they started drawing about 5,000 people a week. The problem was break even was 5,000 people. It was just so hard, and they were so ingrained in this weekly territory thing that they just didn't change it. So Atlanta went from being a break even and then a losing money weekly proposition from being what it previously was, which was the number one profit center. So the company started losing money. Then all of a sudden, all the money that Jim was spending became an issue, and that's kind of so Ole Anderson basically threatened to press charges on him for embezzlement of funds, and they made a deal that Jim tried to make a deal where he could keep his title even though he wouldn't have power, and Ole wouldn't go for that. So Jim was basically forced out of the company. Ole was in it, and so Jim was doing nothing and made his deal with Vince Jr. to come back and be his director of operations. And so, a lot of what happened, was Jim had all the connections, and there was Jim was running a lot of interference, and Jim knew the TV people from his years and years with television. Jim knew arena owners all over the country. And Jim was a very key player, in Vince's expansion. I mean, Vince would have done well without him, but he definitely gave him a lot of connections to get. When Vince was expanding that TV network, Jim was very valuable.
When you touched on Hogan, there's a fascinating picture out there of one of the original Starrcade '83 posters, and it includes Hulk Hogan in the tag match teaming with Wahoo. At some point, apparently, there was a thought on the drawing board that Hogan, who of course was a bona fide headlining star in pro wrestling in the AWA at this point in time, may have been able to work Starrcade. And I wondered if that was something that kind of got lost in the dustbin of history, or if there's a story there.
There's not really a story there. Hogan was booked in New Japan. He was never going to be at Starrcade. There may have been like some signals crossed about something, but it was never going to happen. I mean, Hogan was making far more money. This was a lot of people don't really understand the situation at the time. I mean, New Japan was the #1 wrestling promotion in the world at this point in time, and we're talking late 1983. It generated more money. It it paid better than anybody else. They were #1. And Hogan and Andre the Giant were their two big foreign stars, and they were making $10,000, $15,000 a week. So, people think Hogan was in the AWA, and he was, but it was the AWA between Japan tours. He made more money in Japan than he ever made in the AWA. It's one of those things where, well, they shouldn't put the world title on him. And it's like, well, you want to put your world title on a guy who's gone 4 months out of the year? I mean, and you could. I'm not saying you couldn't, but I'm just saying that there's a lot of things that people don't really understand about that. And that's why Vince had to offer Hogan so much money. People say that Vince never offered anyone a guarantee. Well, he had to offer Hogan a guarantee because Hogan was going to, and at the time when Vince took him, Hogan was going to still go to Japan, but then Vince didn't want him going to Japan anymore, obviously, because Vince needed him. So that's kind of where the Hogan-Japan thing fell apart. But no, he was never going to be in Greensboro. There may have been a thing where somebody called somebody and they thought it was okay, but no, New Japan had a big tag team tournament going on at that time in late 1983 with, loaded with stars, and the guys in those days in the tag team tournament, they had to be there the whole time. There wasn't going back and forth or anything like that.
And Hogan, you mentioned quickly, Roddy Piper. He's on Starrcade 83, would be in New York in short order. Ricky Steamboat on Starrcade 83, he would be in New York. Greg Valentine, Bob Orton, all participating in Starrcade 83. And not only were they jump ship, but they'd all be part of the very first WrestleMania. But we don't hear that really noted a lot, Dave, in terms of, historical trivia. Is that something that has a reason, do you think? Maybe as Vince commanded the narrative over the years of the history of his territory and his business and quickly the industry, that it's never really noted that those participants wrestled on both the first Starrcade and the first WrestleMania?
Yeah, because Vince, at the time, Vince, for years and years and years, wanted that history to go away until he bought the tape library, in which case, the history sort of came back. But even then, I don't think that Vince really wants, there's a lot of things Vince doesn't want, that like there was like a major big show before the first WrestleMania. That was what was a big success and things like that, because Vince wanted to be, the big show, the innovator of big shows, the innovator of everything. So I didn't really, the idea of that there were like big shows in Tokyo at the Tokyo Dome, that there was Starrcades and things like that. It's like, yeah, it was, once they could sell the tapes, the history sort of came back, but I don't think that Vince was really into that history being known. I mean, one of the things that they, that in the old days, they would get so mad at, when I was writing for the National, that I would write about the Tokyo Dome shows because it exposed the idea that somebody other than Vince could promote big shows that drew 50,000 people, and they liked that idea that everybody had, that Vince took this thing from the story from the smoky little armories to major arenas, which of course we all know that's ridiculous because it was in major arenas. Whatever the major arena was in town from the beginning of time, usually the local wrestling promotion did, as long as the local promotion was a viable promotion. If you had a third-rate promotion, no, they didn't necessarily use the NBA arena, but most of your promotions used the nice arena in town, always.
And there's a pretty strong Florida flavor to the show. Not only Dusty, who, worked at many territories as one of the biggest national stars in the industry, including Madison Square Garden. He's there. Gordon Soley, who's, of course, the voice of Championship Wrestling from Florida, and Georgia Championship Wrestling is there. Kevin Sullivan is there. We'd see more and more Florida on future Starrcades. Quickly sketch for us, Dave. What was the arrangement there? Because this is prior to Crockett actually, if I'm not mistaken, buying Florida in the later 80s, right?
I don't know if he actually bought it or took it over. I don't know what the whole terms were, but the idea was that they wanted to close circuit into Florida, so they figured, let's have some Florida guys, number one. And number two, the idea is when you're running a big show and you're supposed to be this big worldwide show, it was very important to the local fans by saying if you have the greatest card of all time, you need to bring in guys that aren't in your territory. So it all worked out, that they would bring in guys. Was Colon on the first one or the second one? I'm trying to remember.
Colon was on the first against Abdul the Butcher, and it was piped in Puerto Rico, and as Gordon Soley said, the inner Caribbean basin.
Right. So that was because they were doing San Juan, and I think that was, again, for that. And also, again, when you ran your really big shows, you often brought in guys from other territories. So it was, and the idea was to make this like this big show of the year where all the top guys would come in from all over the world or all over the NWA anyway, and would pipe the show into their territory. So that was kind of the idea from the very beginning, that it would be it was mainly for the territory, but it would go out of the territory and eventually build to being the NWA's showcase event of the year, because again, in those days, all those promoters worked together to a good degree anyway. I mean, Crockett Stars, would go to Puerto Rico all the time. The guys went from territory to territory. They weren't locked into one territory. They might have a home territory, but if there was a big show in Atlanta, guys would come in from other territories too.
Did Starrcade 83 make it to Florida? Did it go that far? I thought it was just the Greensboro area and Puerto Rico that could see it on closed circuit.
I think that there was I think there may have been one. I know that later that they had a couple in Florida. I'm not sure if the first one did. I think the first one may have had one city in Florida. I think. Interesting.
Yeah, certainly the second, 84, they talk about Mike Graham's match and welcome all of our viewers in, I believe Orlando is the city they mentioned on the broadcast.
Orlando had a closed circuit at the Eddie Graham Sports Stadium, I think is what they called it in those days. And that was the second one. I think the first one may have had like a theater showing or something, but it was not an arena showing.
And so with Dusty, like you said, there's a common misconception that he was booking Mid-Atlantic at this point in time because he would very shortly be the booker, but he did come up with the name Starrcade. So what was the dynamic that he had Jim Crockett's ear such that he could name the big annual show, but not actually have any control or sway or stake in the promotion?
I think that they knew he was coming, but it was kind of like kept secret. You don't want to tell the booker that you're replacing him. And they hadn't replaced him yet, so that was right around the time. That was right around the time that they did. But again, it wouldn't have been that unusual because Dusty was a major power player, and when you're discussing ideas and everything like that, Dusty would be a guy who would be on the ground floor of the ideas because he was the booker in Florida already, and you were using, Florida was a key NWA city, and I mean it's actually amazing Dusty was not on the first show as a wrestler, although he was there. Sure. I mean, because Dusty was a big draw. In fact, it's kind of weird actually that they didn't do a big like bloody Dusty Rhodes match on the first show. I don't know the reason why they didn't.